Welcome to the University of Buffalo Graduate School of Education, Dean's Distinguished Lecture. I'm Jae Kyung Lee, the Dean of the Graduate School of Education. This lecture series is designed to engage the university and the local education community with the distinguished scholars in the critical fields of education. I'd like to thank sponsors of the event today: Adele H. Land Memorial Fund, Charlotte C. Aker Fund for Colloquia on Urban Education, and the University Office of Philanthropy and Alumni Engagement for their generous support. And also thank you, audience, for coming in this inclement weather. I told the speaker that this is a real test of your enthusiasm about the lecture. So now you passed the test. The theme of this year's lecture is college access and completion. And this policy issue has become a buzzword in the media. But there is shortage of evidence-based policy on this topic. As President Obama made a note during his visit to UB, our university is a national leader in helping students enter and complete the college in time and without unbearable debt. However, there is a long way to go, and there are many stumbling blocks on the way, which require system-wide changes beyond individual campus initiatives. So it is my great pleasure and honor to introduce the speaker who knows the terrain more than anyone else in the country and can give us roadmaps for both institutional policy and the government policy based on the empirical research. Dr. Laura Pona is a James S. Reed Professor and founding executive director of the Alliance for Higher Education and Democracy at the University of Pennsylvania. She is the president of the Association for the Study of Higher Education, and she also served as the vice president of the American Educational Research Association's Division J, Post-Secondary Education. In 2014, she was named a fellow of the AERA and also Penn Fellow. Her research on college access and success has been published in many high-impact journals as well as books with both public and private organizational support, such as the U.S. Department of Education's Institute of Education Science and the Lumina Foundation. So she's a real national expert on this topic. So please welcome Dr. Laura Pona.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so very much for that very kind and generous introduction. I can't tell you how honored I am to be here today to be delivering this lecture. I want to thank those who made this possible. I'm very honored to have been selected, and I appreciate all of you coming out today, especially in the weather, to hear this. I applaud your choice of topic, for sure. This is one of the most important topics we can be talking about, I think. I also want to just stress and commend the attention in this lecture series to trying to connect research with policy and practice. The more I do this work, the more frustrated I see at the continued disconnects between our communities, so researchers not knowing enough about how to connect their work with policy and practice, and likewise policy and practice moving forward without enough attention to what we know from research. I'm also deeply honored to be here with colleagues who know so much about this topic. So Lois Weiss, your work has been tremendously important to me as I think through these issues, and I want to just publicly thank you for being such a great colleague and mentor and friend. I also want to acknowledge the terrific higher ed faculty that you have here, Margaret Solly and Nathan Dwan-Marnett, really terrific, and so it's wonderful to have this opportunity to be here on your campus. So by virtue of your attendance here today, I assume that you all have an appreciation for this topic. promoting college access and completion. So just to get a sense of the audience, how many first-generation college students are there here? Yes, good. Anyone who had trouble figuring out how to pay the costs of higher education? Anyone who struggled to figure out how to navigate academically through our crazy systems? Anyone who's worked with students or others trying to figure out this complexity? Yeah, so you all have a lot of firsthand experience with these issues, and by virtue of where you are now are successes along this pipeline. As you know, however, so many individuals continue to experience challenges as they try to navigate the academics, the finances, the information parts of our pipeline to higher education degree attainment. Understanding how to improve college access and success has been a passion and interest of mine since I was an undergraduate, also trying to figure out how to pay the bills. Over the course of my career, I've had a number of really terrific and informative experiences, both on the practice side and on the research side, to try to improve my understanding of these issues. And there's still lots more that we need to know, but it's a pleasure to have an opportunity to talk about some of the ways that I think about these issues today. So as Dean Leeds said, today there's growing recognition about the importance of improving higher education attainment. I think this is one of the most important and pressing issues of our time. Clearly, higher education attainment is increasingly important to individual and societal well-being. And so no talk from someone from Penn would be complete without a reference to Benjamin Franklin, the founder of the University of Pennsylvania. One of the things Ben Franklin said was, an investment in knowledge pays the best interest. And with so many of the things that Ben Franklin has said, I think this continues to be as true it was in the 18th century as it is in the 21st century. Okay, so we know that higher education results in numerous benefits. Individuals who enter and complete college have higher earnings, lower rates of unemployment and poverty, better health, better working conditions, etc. It's also important for us to continue to stress the ways in which society is better off when more people have higher levels of educational attainment. So with higher levels of education come higher rates of voting, volunteering, less reliance on social support programs, a higher tax base, lower crime. This figure is just one representation of the positive and increasingly positive benefits that result from higher education, and namely this is in terms of higher earnings. So especially over the last 15 years, average earnings have increased for those who have at least a bachelor's degree. In contrast, the incomes, after controlling for inflation, for folks who have lower levels of education have remained relatively flat or even declined. So clearly, although many forces contribute to national well-being, I argue a nation or a state within a nation cannot be prosperous without a highly educated population. That being said, as you probably have also heard the rhetoric around the educational attainment in the US compared with other nations. So this is one depiction of the extent to which the US has fallen behind other nations in terms of the educational attainment of its population. In short, the US led the world in terms of the share of young adults holding at least a bachelor's type of post-secondary degree in the year 2000. But today, the percentage of adults aged 25 to 34 who hold at least a bachelor's type of credential is lower in the US than a number of other nations. So why does it matter? So I argue that, and others argue, unless educational attainment improves, workers in the United States won't have the education and training that's required to meet workforce demands in our global knowledge-based economy. So these are data from Tony Carnevale's Center on Workforce and the Economy at Georgetown University. He and his team project that 63% of jobs will require education beyond high school by 2018, and this compares with just 28% in 1973. Carnevale and colleagues also project that at the current rate of degree production, the demand for workers with at least an associate's degree will exceed the supply by 3 million by 2018. Improvements in our education attainment in this country, I think, are also important to counteract the remarkable and growing income inequality in the US. So according to the OECD, in 2008, so this is a little bit dated now, but in 2008, the income of the top 10% of households in the US was 6 times greater than the income of the bottom 10%. The US has greater inequality on this measure than all other OECD nations except for Turkey, Israel, Chile, and Mexico. And so it's really amazing when those aren't nations that we typically compare ourselves with. As Nobel Prize-winning economist Joseph Stiglitz asserts, quote, even though the US is one of the world's wealthiest nations, the magnitude of income inequality threatens its continued economic stability and growth and has potential negative consequences for its democracy and global influence. So among the recognized remedies for reducing economic inequality is improved educational attainment. However, the persisting gaps in higher education outcomes that we have in this country raise questions about the extent to which higher education is really serving as this engine of social mobility. So one of the issues that's important for us to keep underscoring is that even attention to the average levels of educational attainment, so saying that the US has fallen behind other nations overall, masks the magnitude of differences across groups within the US in educational attainment. In the US, college-related outcomes vary dramatically based on demographic characteristics, so family income, race, ethnicity, parents' education. They also vary based on where you live, and this is something that I'm paying increasingly attention to. So they vary based on the state you happen to live in, and they vary based on where in a state you happen to live. A central premise of the work that I do is really stressing that the US cannot achieve the levels of educational attainment that are required for workforce competitiveness without closing these gaps across groups. So I've included just a few slides to give you a sense, and many of you may know these data already, but to give you a sense of the magnitude of the gaps across groups. So this slide shows that educational attainment has increased over the past decade or so, regardless of race, ethnicity. But despite those increases, we haven't made much progress in closing the gaps across groups. So educational attainment continues to be considerably lower for African Americans and Hispanics than for Asians and whites. Another issue has to do with the differences in educational attainment by gender. And so on average, educational attainment is lower now for men than for women. And here we see that this is occurring across racial ethnic groups. Particularly important is paying attention to the educational attainment of African American men and Hispanic men. So one reason, of course, why attention to racial ethnic group differences matters is because of the changing demographic characteristics of our population. Here we see the steady decline nationwide in the share of public high school graduates who are white. By the middle of the next decade or so, whites will represent no more than half of the nation's public high school graduates. And some states, of course, are already majority, quote unquote, minority. Okay, so how do we improve educational attainment? So higher education attainment is clearly the result of a longitudinal cumulative process. We could argue that the process arguably begins at birth or even before, given the ways that many educational opportunities and advantages are structured into our society. Today, I'm going to try to make this more manageable by focusing only on the directly college-related part of the pipeline. Okay, so looking only at this part of the pipeline and starting with college enrollment rates, here we see the differences in college enrollment rates based on family income. So there's a general upward trending nature to the lower two lines, the lower two income quintiles. And so this suggests some improvement in college going rates. But again, as we saw earlier, we're not making as much progress as we should be in terms of closing the gaps. So even with the improvements, college enrollment rates were about 30 percentage points lower for high school graduates from the lowest family income quintile than for those in the highest family income quintile in 2012. The differences occur in every outcome that we could look at. So here we see differences even for those who enroll in college and the extent to which folks earn a bachelor's degree or any other type of degree. So this slide shows that more than half, about 58% of dependent students from the highest family income quartile who first enrolled in college completed a bachelor's degree within 5 years. By comparison, just 26% of those who entered college from the lowest family income quartile finished a bachelor's degree within 5 years. Okay, so as you probably came into this talk convinced already that we had issues that we had to address. Let's talk some about what we know about the sources of these gaps and how we might make some improvements. So it's been, I've been looking at these issues since I began my doctoral studies. And over this time, the amount of research on college-related issues, college access and success-related issues has really increased considerably over this time. We've learned a whole lot, I think. So I think the research shows us how it's important to have different theoretical perspectives to inform these issues. We've learned things by looking at them from multiple points of views. We've also learned through multiple types of methods, so both qualitative methods, quantitative methods, and interesting to see the increasing sophistication of some of the quantitative methods that are being used. So no one study solves these, tells us all that we need to know, but together these studies have generated considerable improvements in our knowledge base on these topics. One caveat, though, it's important to recognize that still most of what we know tends to be based on traditional age students and assuming a traditional college-going process. And in part, this reflects the availability of data. So we have nationally sponsored data sets that follow students from secondary school into higher education. And so with those data that I and others have used, we have a better understanding of what matters in that transition process from high school into college. We know still less about what's happening for adults or people who've been out of high school for several years in terms of how their college-going related processes work. And I think this is a really important direction for us to learn more about, especially given the nature of lifelong learning, the importance of lifelong learning in this country, and the demographics of who actually is enrolling in college. So in fall of 2011, about 2/3 of all undergraduates were age 24 or younger. This slide shows that at least 40% of students, however, were over age 24 at some sectors of institutions, so public two-year institutions, private two-year, as well as the for-profit institutions. So what's going on in higher ed varies a lot across institutions. One of the central assumptions of the work that I've done is that students make college enrollment-related decisions based on a comparison of the benefits with the costs. So this is a central tenet of human capital theory. Human capital theory assumes that students calculate the benefits based on their perceptions of their academic readiness to succeed in college and the likelihood that they'll finish a college program. They also consider their perceptions of earnings that will result from higher education, as well as the other benefits that will accrue. They also make cost calculations based on their perceptions of their ability to pay. So they calculate their ability to pay based on their perceptions of their family's resources, as well as their perceptions of the various costs. So human capital theory, so I've emphasized perceptions, obviously, in what I've just said. So human capital theory doesn't assume that people have perfect and complete information about everything, only that students are rational, or individuals are rational when they act on the information that they have and the information that they have. Consistent with the predictions of human capital theory, we've learned from research, and I really organize these predictors and forces that matter in this process into 3 buckets. So academics, having the academic readiness that's required to enroll and succeed in college, the money, having the financial resources that are required to pay the cost of attendance and participation. And then that 3rd bucket around information about college and college-related processes and the support needed to navigate our complex system and maximize opportunities. So one of the things that I've argued in my work is that the economic theory of human capital, so it recognizes the role of perceptions and informations, but it doesn't shed much light or insight into how students actually form their perceptions or where they get their information. Perspectives from sociology, I think, are helpful in trying to understand and really conceptualize more completely the ways in which students are making these decisions. So drawing from sociological perspectives, we've learned that students' college-related decisions and behaviors don't happen in a vacuum. Rather, they depend on the context in which students are embedded. So for instance, whether or not a student aspires to go to college and knows how to acquire information about college-going processes is influenced by the knowledge and experiences of other members of their family, the college-going norms of the communities they live in, and the perceived value of, that employers place on having a college degree. Whether or not an individual is academically ready for college depends on the college-related resources and college-going culture of the high school that a student attends. It's also influenced by the state policies that are in place, so the extent to which a state has particular academic requirements for graduating from high school, for example. Whether or not an individual persists in college to finish a degree is influenced by the academic characteristics of the other students attending the institution and the institutional resources that the college attended. And whether someone has the financial resources required to pay for college is influenced by a whole host of contextual variables as well. So the family situation, what a student learns from the high school they attend about the availability of resources to pay for college, the state policies related to college affordability, et cetera. So let's try to unpack some of these. And I want to talk about them in terms of some of the important changes that I think are going on with regard to academic readiness, financial resources, and information. So there are a number of ways in which the context with regard to academic readiness, financial resources, and information are changing that are important for us to consider as we try to identify how we're going to make a difference in improving attainment and closing gaps across groups. And there are 5 issues that I want to just talk about briefly before talking about some of these more specifically. So one important issue has to do with the continued problems with regard to academic readiness for college. So inadequate academic preparation in high school translates into high rates of participation in developmental coursework in college. This slide, and again, these data are a little bit old. It's hard to get current data on some of these issues, but clearly a considerable share of undergraduate students are participating in remedial or developmental college before they can enter college-level coursework. And logically, this suggests the challenges that students experience as they're required to extend their time to degree, time enrolled in order to get a degree, the additional costs, et cetera. So there's a fair amount of research going on right now to try to understand how to improve the success of students who are participating in remedial or developmental coursework. But this is an important part of the process that certainly warrants attention. Another important issue has to do with the differences in the academic resources that folks have based on where they live and the characteristics of the environments that they're in. So this slide, so this is from Sean Reardon at Stanford University. He offers one picture of the variation in resources that students from different demographic groups are bringing to their college-related decisions and experiences. So here we see, and these are after controlling for inflation, higher income, so we see that the investment that families from lower income groups are making in their children's, their early childhood, at the early childhood level, have been relatively flat over time. In contrast, we see the upward trend in the investment for folks from the higher income families. And this pattern really resonates, I think, tremendously with the findings from Lois and her colleagues' book, Class Warfare, Class Race and College Admissions in Top-Tier Secondary Schools. So I think there are 2 really important dimensions to try to unpack. So one is what's happening for folks who have advantage in terms of perpetuating and really raising up and widening the gap from that in terms of opportunity. And then what's happening with the lower income families and really trying to raise opportunity for that group. 2 different types of, or very different types of experiences. The differences in resources continue on through high school and all along the pipeline. So here we see the differences across racial ethnic groups and the shares of students who take various math and science courses. So there are not that many findings from social science research that are universally accepted as truth. One of those that does, though, happen to be have that acceptance, I think, is the finding that Cliff Edelman made a number of years ago about how folks who take at least Algebra 2 in high school are much more likely to finish a bachelor's degree. I think most folks recognize how important that threshold is. And that was a number of years ago. With that in mind, it's surprising, I think, to see these continued gaps across racial ethnic groups in the share of students, high school graduates who've taken at least Algebra 2 in high school. And you can see here the differences across groups and the other types of courses that students are taking. Differences in course taking across groups reflect at least two different forces. So one has to do with the extent to which different types of courses are offered in different high schools. And then there's also the extent to which students from different groups are participating in the courses that are available in a school. So with colleagues at Penn, I have a study that was published recently that looks at the extent to which the International Baccalaureate Diploma Program may be a mechanism to promote students' academic readiness for college. So this is a program that's ostensibly designed to provide a more rigorous academic preparation for college. So consistent with what IB said it was trying to do, we found that IB is now available in more and more diverse high schools. But at the same time, the demographic characteristics of the students who are participating in IB, even when available, has been much less diverse. So we're making more progress, it seems, from our study, in making these courses available ostensibly within schools, but less in terms of understanding how to make sure folks in the schools actually are able to participate. So another important force that influences academic readiness has to do with this continued disconnect between what's expected to graduate from high school and what's required to academically succeed in college. The College Board reported in 2011 that only 41% of states, so less than half of states, had aligned their high school graduation requirements with college expectations. Only 43% at that time had a P20 longitudinal data system. One recent development in this space is the Common Core State Standards. So the Common Core State Standards, as I'm sure many of you know, seeks to establish standards of learning in language arts and math that ensure that high school students are academically ready for college. To date, 43 states, as well as the District of Columbia, have adopted the standards in whole or in part. Certainly this, I think, holds promise for helping to ensure that folks who graduate from high school with a standard high school diploma are academically ready to enroll in college-level courses. However, we're still in the implementation stages, so whether that promise will be realized is yet to be seen. Okay, the second issue that we should be paying attention to is the higher education finance model, and there's some important issues going on here that are important for us to consider as well. So one has to do with who's paying the costs of going to college. So we know that money matters. Students from low-income families are particularly sensitive in terms of their enrollment when tuition increases or financial aid increases. I hope you can at least get a sense from this chart. So the red line, if you can see it, generally represents FTE enrollment, and that's been increasing over time. In part because of increases in enrollment, the appropriations from state governments to public institutions per FTE has been declining. So that's the blue bar. Now, along with that declining share of the total costs that are being paid by state governments has been an increasing share that's being covered by net tuition. So what's happening over time is a shifting in the responsibility of paying the cost of higher education from states or the public to students. Given these trends, it's not surprising that more and more students are borrowing to pay college costs. Data from the College Board show that nearly half of all aid awarded to undergraduates now is in the form of loans. Research that I and others have done shows that borrowing pays off for many students, but there's good reason to be concerned about these trends. So one concern has to do with the growing level of debt, and data from the Federal Reserve Board show that, or suggest that with recent increases in debt for student loan debt are coming some declines in other types of consumer borrowing, which may have some important consequences for our society. There also is a variation in willingness to use loans to pay college costs. So as we're increasingly relying on loans as a mechanism to pay the cost of higher education, that has important consequences, I think, for who's actually participating in higher education. This is tricky, though, because the differences in the willingness to use loans reflects, I think, the riskiness of loans, right? So borrowing pays off for many students, especially those who are able to go to college and finish their degree program, get the job with the higher earnings. But for those who are not able to finish and get that job, then you have the debt to repay without that higher paying job to pay off the debt. Some students are responding to the aversion to borrowing by working more while they're enrolled, and this is another important issue for us to be thinking about. So working high number of hours while also being enrolled in coursework has important implications. Even just logically, there are only so many hours in a day, and so when you're spending more time in paid employment, we should be thinking about what that means for students' academic engagement. Okay, another issue that's important in the context as we try to figure out policy and practice has to do with the changing higher education options. So here we see shifts over time in the types of colleges and universities that folks are attending, and this is just the the four-year sector only. So over the past decade, the shares of students attending for-profit four-year colleges have been increasing. For-profit higher education providers are not new. They're consistent with the market characteristic of our higher education system. So in many ways, this growth in for-profit enrollment reflects a market response. These institutions are responding to a need that isn't being met by other types of higher education providers. One reason that we should be paying attention, though, especially as we're having a conversation about stratification of opportunity, has to do with the characteristics of who enrolls in these institutions. So here, perhaps you can get a sense. The second to bottom row is the for-profit sector. Students from low-income families represent nearly half, 45% of students attending for-profit institutions. In contrast, low-income students represent less than a fifth of students attending private, not-for-profit four-year institutions. So there are pretty dramatic differences in the demographic characteristics of students attending different types of institutions. The pattern for students from the highest income families is the reverse. So students from high-income families are considerably better represented at the private, not-for-profit four-year institutions than they are at the private for-profit. One reason why this matters is with regard to the resources that are available at different types of institutions. So we have stratification of resources by institutional type. And this plays out in a real way for students' lives in terms of their likelihood of finishing a program that they start. So at the less selective four-year institutions, at the for-profit institutions, the shares of students who are completing a bachelor's degree within 6 years are considerably lower than at the more selective institutions. And this has real costs and consequences for students. And this is with 6 years, so that's 2 additional years of tuition and fees and time out of the labor market and whatnot. And still a tremendous number of students not finishing in that time. There's also, I think from a practice and a research perspective, we also should be thinking about the changing options in terms of online and MOOCs and things like that. So MOOCs, massive open online courses, they're certainly they've received a considerable amount of attention, and they're reaching large numbers of students or individuals. I have an article that was published in Educational Researcher in December that begins to try to unpack some of this. I began that study because there was a lot of rhetoric on my campus. Penn offers a number of MOOCs about how MOOCs were going to solve the access problem and solve the higher education finance problem. Of course, in the current form, this is not it, and we can talk more about that. But I think that we, from a research perspective, have an obligation to try to understand what these new developments might mean in terms of different types of outcomes. So e-learning is not new, but I do think that we are at a point, given the important goals that we have for increasing access and the important constraints that we have on the availability of public resources to fund that access, that we have to think about the role of technology and the extent to which technology may help achieve these goals. So that's not a new question. It seems like something that's especially important right now. Okay, The fourth issue, contextual issue I want to talk a little bit about is information. So in the US, information matters, right? We have so much choice in our system, so many different types of options, and that reflects a core American value, right? But choice works against people who aren't able to figure out how to navigate that choice successfully. So this figure shows that high numbers of students per counselor on average, and really not much change over time. And again, these are averages. So according to NACAC's 2013 State of College Admissions Report, there are more than 1,000 students per counselor on average in California. So we rely a lot on counselors to be that conduit to help traditional age students navigate this process, but the numbers alone suggest the challenges. And then of course, when you ask counselors what they're actually able to do during a day, spending time on post-secondary admissions counseling is just one small piece of that puzzle. So here you see that they report on average 33% of their time is devoted to post-secondary admissions counseling. A whole lot of other things that counselors are responsible for in addition to this responsibility. Okay, the fifth point that I just want to stress here is that one of the issues I think that's in the rhetoric around trying to increase educational attainment is the search for if we can just find the one magic thing to do this and solve the problem. And I think that this is an important issue there are many things that we can be doing better, but clearly this is a complicated process with many different forces playing a role, many different players. We need a comprehensive approach. There's not just one solution here that's going to fit our diverse society and diverse system of higher education and diverse characteristics of students. So despite decades of attention from policymakers, practitioners, and other conserved individuals, opportunity to realize the benefits of higher education clearly still varies based on demographic characteristics. It also varies on where you happen to live. So we seem to be, the depressing way to frame this is that we're in a vicious circle where increased stratification of educational and economic opportunity is inevitable. So continued unequal access to academic resources, financial resources, information that's required to enroll and succeed in college will perpetuate inequality. Now, the optimistic part of this is that trying to think about that there are policies and practices that we can be thinking about to try to ensure that higher education acts more as an engine of social mobility. So as we'll talk a little bit more, I think that there are multiple different players that are important in breaking this vicious cycle. Government policy, colleges, universities, schools and school districts, other organizations. One of the most important things that I'd like to stress is that the onus, and I'm sure that you recognize this, but the onus cannot be on students and their families. We need to really be thinking about the systemic and structural forces that are contributing to these persisting gaps. So one central premise of my program of research is that public policy is critical to raising attainment and closing gaps in attainment across groups. The federal government and state governments play an important role by creating and funding public policies that both increase the demand for higher education and that increases the supply of different higher education institutions. So these public policy essentially is a government intervention in the market. And I would argue, consistent with public policy frameworks, that this intervention is warranted given the many public benefits of higher education that we have to keep stressing, as well as the importance of creating a more level playing field for higher education opportunity. So the federal government, with regard to higher education attainment, the federal government's most important role has been with regard to the provision of financial aid and other financial resources that are needed to pay for college. So in 2013-14, undergraduates nationwide received $184 billion in student financial aid from all sources. So that's quite a large amount of money. Now that's aid broadly defined, so it includes aid in the form, and we can argue whether this is actually aid, tax credits, tax deductions, and loans. About 18% of that total pie, though, is from Pell grants. Now, federal spending on Pell Grants is particularly important because, as we know, Pell Grants are aid that does not have to be repaid, and they're very targeted to students from the lowest income families. Total expenditures on the federal Pell Grant program have generally been increasing over time. They peaked in 2010 at $38 billion. In the most recent data available, 9.2 million undergraduates received a federal Pell Grant, so Pell Grants are clearly benefiting a large number of individuals. One challenge is that the increases in the maximum Pell Grant haven't kept pace with the increases in net tuition. So the bottom line, if you can see on this chart, is the trends in maximum Pell Grant controlling for inflation, and that's relatively flat. In the most recent year available, the maximum Pell Grant covered about 63% of average published tuition and fees at public four-year institutions. Earlier this month, maybe you saw the Republicans in the House of Representatives propose freezing the Pell Grant maximum for 10 years. So you can imagine what that might do to the future purchasing power of the Pell Grant. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit now about the utility of examining state policy. And this is really one of the central premises of the book that Joni Finney and I had released in April on state policy. So this slide gives you a sense. I've been indicating to you and arguing that place matters. So here you get a sense, I hope, of the variations in educational attainment based on the state in which folks live. So at the high end of the continuum, more than 45% of adults have at least an associate's degree in Massachusetts, Connecticut, New Hampshire. At the other end of the continuum, less than 30% of adults had at least an associate's degree in Mississippi, Kentucky, Louisiana, Arkansas, and West Virginia. So quite a variation. Those, yeah, right. So what do we know about the role of state policy in improving higher education attainment? So I mentioned Joni Finney. Joni's a colleague of mine at Penn GSE. Before she joined us, she was the vice president at the National Center for Public Policy and Higher Education. And one of the things that the National Center did was it released measuring up every 2 years from 2000 to 2008. I think that measuring up was a really important mechanism for changing the conversation and really changing our focus to really point to the role of states with regard to improving higher education attainment. So measuring up was a series of report cards that essentially graded each state on measures of college preparation, participation, completion, the benefits of higher education, and affordability. Measuring up told states about how they were doing on those indicators, and it provided trends over time and how states were performing. One thing that it didn't do, though, was explain, well, why? So why do some states get higher grades or lower grades than others, and why do some states improve and other states decline? And so those questions, trying to understand the how and the why, underlie our book. And so the central question that we were looking at was, how does a state with particular economic, political, historical, and educational context improve its educational attainment and close gaps in attainment across groups? And our particular focus was on public policy. So in terms of what we did, just very briefly, we did case studies of 5 different states: Georgia, Illinois, Maryland, Texas, and Washington. We collected a whole host of different types of data. We spent time in each state. One of the interesting things that influenced our results is, and for those of you who are doing research design classes right now, history mattered, I think. So we were collecting data in the height of the economic downturn. It seemed like every time we were in the state capital of one of these places, there was a new dramatic headline about the most recent budget cuts that the state was trying to face. And so that was an important element of context for us. We talked to a whole bunch of different people, leaders of the higher education associations, people in the legislature, the governor's office, presidents of universities, folks on the K through 12 side. I think our research builds on, there's a number of different types of studies in this area that I can talk more about if you're interested in another time, just in the interest of time now. Our states, so one question you may have is, why did we select these states? So we tried to select states that varied in a number of important ways. So they vary in terms of their performance, their higher education performance, and their trends in attainment over time. They also vary in terms of their demographic characteristics. So we wanted to select states that were diverse in particular characteristics. So Georgia and Maryland have high percentages of their population that are African American. Texas, high percentage of its population is Hispanic. Illinois really mirrors the national average. Washington, less diverse in terms of blacks and Hispanics, but growing Hispanic population. We also wanted to have states that had different configurations of their higher education systems, but we also wanted to be sure to include states that had large enrollments in community colleges, given our focus on trying to improve attainment for students from historically underrepresented groups. And we also, one of the things that we've tried to do as we wrote up our study was take into account the economic context. So, I mentioned that we were collecting data during the economic downturn, and so a lot of the folks that we talked with, especially from the state policy perspective, emphasized that, it's just such a dire situation with the recession. One of the things that we try to point out is that the problems with regard to educational attainment and the gaps in attainment across groups were happening before the economic downturn. Right, so some of the challenges were exacerbated by the constraints in fiscal resources. The other important issues that with structural budget deficits, and so that's what this slide describes, structural budget deficits. There's not going to be a lot more money available unless we decide to increase taxes and things like that to fund things like higher education in the coming years. So and that foreshadows one of our conclusions about this, about the importance of thinking about the resources that we do have. So this slide gives you a sense of the stories that we found in the 5 states. So in Georgia, and I'll just tell you a little bit. So Georgia, the headline for us was perpetuating disparity. So Georgia, below average on most measures of higher education outcomes, and considerably lower performance for the large black and growing Hispanic population than for the white population. In Georgia, one of the things that we point to are essentially the regressive higher education financial aid policies. So many of you may be familiar. Anybody from Georgia here? Yes. So the Hope Scholarship Program, regressive policy awards financial aid based on academic merit, and when policies are rewarding academic, we know the positive relationship between income and traditional measures of academic achievement. In Georgia, there was also and is a high production of workforce certificates by the technical colleges, but at the time of our study, weak policies for enabling students who start in the extensive technical college system to transfer into degree granting programs. In Illinois, a story of decline. So Illinois was a top performing state in the 1990s, in the early 1990s, and then had sharp declines at the time of our study. So one of the things that we point to and think about is the change in the governance structure of higher education. So in the early 1990s, Illinois had a system of systems that served to help coordinate and really speak to a public agenda for higher education in the state. And over time, the dismantling of the system of systems gave much more local control to the institutions. And one of the findings from our study, or one of the recommendations is the priorities of colleges and universities are not necessarily the priorities of the state, right? They're different preferences that play out. There was also an unraveling of some of the strategic finance policies. So Illinois had a very well-regarded need-based financial aid program in the early 1990s and experienced some challenges in continuing to fund that to meet the need of all students moving forward. Maryland, much accomplished, much at stake. So Maryland was our relatively high performer, but still considerably lower performance for the African Americans and white residents of the state. Trying to figure out in Maryland questions about one of the historically black colleges, in particular Morgan State University. In Maryland, it was so trying to figure out what works is challenging. So Maryland's a small state. It has a strong tradition of political leadership for higher education. But one of the positive things is that they have a comprehensive plan for financing higher education going forward. In Texas, hard choices ahead. So one of the strengths of Texas, and I think this may reflect in part the demographic characteristics of the population, is the real consensus that there is a need to improve higher education performance, especially for the lower performing groups. Their master plan was called Closing the Gaps, and they were regularly assessing progress towards achieving the benchmarks that had set. One of the challenges that we point to is, at the same time as there's extensive attention to closing the gaps, there's also important goal of trying to increase the research mission of some of the research universities in the state. And so we just raised the question, when resources are finite, what are the trade-offs of allocating money to increasing attainment versus increasing the research capacity of your research universities that may not serve the same populations? And then Washington was state policy leadership vacuum. And so one of the issues in Washington is there's very high completion rate for folks who enter the public four-year institutions, but relatively small share of students enter those institutions. And when you think about some of the big employers in Washington, so a high need to increase bachelor's degree production there. And so it's just one of the, right, and so a number of issues going on there with regard to the role of community colleges versus the four-year institutions in the state. So one of our challenges in the book, and for those of you who do qualitative research, is trying to figure out, well, those state stories are so different. What are the themes that cut across those? Are there some lessons that we can be learning more broadly? Here's a picture of the lessons a picture that we tried to develop to summarize those lessons. So really this model has 5 underlying tenets. So one is that the context matters. This is at the foundation of the model. In order to understand what sorts of public policies are going to improve attainment, there has to be consideration of the historical, economic, political, cultural context, as well as the characteristics of the higher education system. A second premise of this work is that we identified 3 categories of policies. So again, we didn't want to come up with any particular type of policy recommendation, but really pointing to the categories of goals that we're trying to achieve with our policies. So one has to do with the strategic use of fiscal resources to improve college affordability. And essentially this is related to the ways in which the fiscal levers that are available to a state policymaker come together to shape affordability. And so those levers include public appropriations, so appropriations to institutions in the state, who has tuition setting authority, and the financial aid policies in the state. And affordability is really determined by how those things come together relative to family income. Public policy, like research, tends to emphasize or look at one of those things, each of those things in isolation, right? And so what we're trying to stress is to look at how they come together. And of the 5 states, Maryland has made some progress in trying to think about those things, those different levers together. A second category of policies has to do with the preparation and movement of students. So, the extent to which students are able to move from K through 12 into higher education. I showed you the slides on developmental education. We are losing students there. In all 5 of our states, they have had, like many states, at one time some sort of P20, P16, some sort of entity that had been established. But even with that ostensible organizational structure, still more need for policy to think about how we can ensure that students actually are able to navigate that transition. There's also transition issues with regard to the movement of students once they enter higher ed. So many students don't attend just one institution, they transfer from one institution to another. And the extent to which students are able to navigate that transition and not lose academic credit is a real problem in many states, certainly in the 5 states we looked at. That third category has to do with the optimization, what we call the optimization of system capacity. And so all 5 of our states, to some extent, are trying to figure out how to meet the educational needs of its population with the higher education resources that it has available. So I mentioned before Washington State's issue with regard to increasing bachelor's degree attainment. Washington has a relatively small number of public four-year institutions, and they're not necessarily located where the population is, right? So, and it has an extensive system of community colleges. So the challenge is to try to figure out, well, how can they improve bachelor's degree attainment given this extensive community college system? So one of the issues has to do with transfer. Washington also was allowing some of its two-year colleges to award applied baccalaureate degrees. And so there are a lot of strategies that are being adopted that raise questions for, that have some potential strengths and potential worries that we should be thinking about. So underlying that, those three categories of policies is the role of state policy leadership. And what we argue here is that, let me just skip ahead. What we argue here is that all states have policies, right? So it's not like we're making these recommendations where nothing is going on. The challenge, I think, is to try to ensure that these policies are oriented towards achieving a particular goal. And what we argue is the importance of the goal of improving attainment and closing gaps in attainment across groups. We also emphasize the role of steering, and so I think that one of the issues going on right now is just the relative role of institutions and state government in determining issues like tuition setting and other types of outcomes that are important to attainment. If I were going to draw the picture over, I would figure out a way to make equity more of a transparent part of the model, but a clear conclusion from our study is that the policies that we have in the agenda, the public agenda, has to be oriented toward improving equity. So a state's failure to ensure that college is affordable, to ensure that all students are academically prepared, to ensure that students have high quality higher education outcomes, and so high quality post-secondary options. A failure to do those things disproportionately impacts those who are now not well served by our higher educational system. I just want to say a word about other types of policies and practices. So state and federal policy clearly matters, but there's also other players in this puzzle that are important to consider, and all have an obligation, I think, to pay greater attention to improving attainment. So, as I've been trying to emphasize, we need a comprehensive approach that recognizes the roles and responsibilities of different players. K-12 districts and schools have to ensure that students can have access to academically rigorous courses and provide the supports necessary for all students to succeed in the courses. We also have to think about the ways that we can help students successfully navigate both the college choice process and the student financial aid system, given the constraints on the availability of people, counselors. So technology, many people are pointing right now to the role of technology in helping with that information-related component of the college-related transition. That being said, though, converting information, so I think we've done a lot of good work in putting information out there. How we convert information into knowledge that folks can use to actually make good decisions is harder. So I think that's an area where we need more attention. We also need greater action from colleges and universities. Clearly, the low completion rates that I showed you are important to be paying attention to. We need to somehow ensure that all students have the knowledge, the resources, the support that they can actually finish the programs that they enter, especially when we're relying on loans to finance higher education. I think we're getting, there's an important issue there with the amount of risk that we're putting on students when we don't provide the supports that they need in order to finish their programs. There are also a whole lot of other organizations in this space, college access related organizations. Even if we solve the academic readiness and the financial resources problem, I think that there's still going to be some students who are going to need that additional support. So I see a continued role for those types of organizations moving forward. And clearly right now, with so many students who are not well served by our current system, those organizations are really important. Okay, so clearly there are many challenges to improving higher education attainment and closing gaps. As Martin Luther King stated in 1964, quote, "I would like to use as a subject from which to speak tonight the American dream. And I use this subject because America is essentially a dream yet unfulfilled. The substance of the dream is expressed in some very familiar words found in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is the dream." So we've made some progress since 1964, but 50 years after the march from Selma to Montgomery, we know that there is more progress that's required to achieve the dream and ensure that all students have the opportunity to access and succeed in higher education. The need to create meaningful improvements in higher education attainment is more important now than ever before, harking back to those increases in benefits that I showed you at the beginning. So whether we're researchers, policymakers, practitioners, parents, caring adults, I think we all have an important role to play. So thank you. Look forward to the conversation.
Hello, everybody. I'm Lois Weiss from the Graduate School of Education, and it is my pleasure, distinct honor, to welcome Dr. Laura Perna from the University of Pennsylvania. What we want to do with the time remaining, we have approximately half an hour, is we'd like people to ask questions. I myself have many questions, but I think I'll wait. Ask questions, and please, if you do have a question, confine yourself to one question and come up to the mic, and then as other people talk, hopefully we'll have a chance to get to your further questions. So would anybody like to start the conversation? Please just walk up to the mic.
Hi, Laura.
Hi.
Good to see you again. So we have a legacy here in Buffalo from the University of Pennsylvania. If you've heard about the Say Yes to Education program, one of your alums actually started that. And so Say Yes is something that I've been thinking a lot about here. And really, my question goes to looking at the role that communities play in access. I think that we've been seeing increasing interest in this. Say Yes is about communities. I was in Michigan when the Kalamazoo Promise was announced. And one of the challenges that I'm seeing as I look at some of this work is that communities are really effective at developing strategies that adapt to the unique context within which they operate. But they're also constrained by state policy and federal policy. And it seems to me that the challenge that we face right now is how do we align the constraints that state policies provide and the unique contributions that communities can make in order to address access at a local level?
It's a good question. I don't know. I think, do you have a good example of where this is happening, where there is good alignment? When I think even about, there's so much, what's happening within states varies dramatically, and it's something that we point to in looking at our 5 states. It's certainly true in other states like Pennsylvania and New Jersey, where I live. And there's a lot of variation in the extent to which communities are well served and the extent to which state policy is able to recognize those variations across based on place. Do you have examples?
Well, the one example here with...
Nate, would you mind going back to the mic, please? We can hear you, but I'm not sure that everybody
So
knows.
the one example here, which, it's tough to replicate policies in any place, but Say Yes works in New York State because our tuitions are lower than average in public four-year institutions, and our need-based aid is higher than average, right? So there was some intentionality about the choice of choosing New York State, but how do you develop locally based strategies that are well aligned with the current policy context and the changing policy context? I think is the challenge. School reform is the same way. I look at the challenges we face in Buffalo right now, trying to figure out how to increase academic preparation. And if we don't weigh in on the school reform agenda when we're talking about college access, we miss a big part of it.
Right.
So I think that would be my best example.
Yeah, I think that's a good example. It's interesting to think about the ways in which policies are aligned and linked and have different consequences for each other. So in our study, we really try to focus specifically on state policy, acknowledging that we're missing potential federal-state interactions and state and local school district or state and college or other types of state and local policy. One of the ways in which we've been thinking a little bit about the linking of policy, so I pointed at the Hope Scholarship program before as a negative, right? So it's awarding financial aid to the academically best and brightest, and with the shortfall, it's so many things, right? It's funded by the lottery, and who buys lottery tickets? Not the folks who are going to college, right? Also in the economic downturn, when the lottery had shortfalls, they ratcheted up even further the academic criteria. But one of the unintended, or one of the other aspects of it is I think that it helped to keep tuition low in Georgia, because the state was paying for tuition for those who received it. It was an informal mechanism for the state to be paying attention to, well, what's going to be the outlay that's required with this generous financial aid. And now with the economic downturn, and it's changed some, tuition is increasing some. Those are the sorts of mechanisms that I think that we need to have. We need to have more intentionality about how different types of policies they create incentives, and they create different types of consequences for people in different states, in different places within those states. It's I'm gonna think more about that.
Can I just ask a further add-on question? I am very familiar with what's going on in Georgia. If those of you who don't know that context, they do have this Hope Scholarship, and it funds the top 10% of the class, I think. Is it higher?
It's not a 10% plan, but it's a very small, I don't know, it's a good question, what percentage?
It takes a certain portion of the people, and what they're trying to do they're trying to raise the rankings of the University of Georgia, as you very well know. And so what they're doing is they're trying to buy the people who might otherwise leave the state and go other places. I personally know people who got into Columbia and decided to go to the University of Georgia because it was essentially free. So my question is, and just pushing a little bit on what Nate was asking, without altering the criteria by which colleges and universities are ranked, is there any way that we can really break into this? Because University of Georgia is not doing anything other than trying to raise itself in the rankings.
Right. So I think that gets at the issue of trying to figure out how states can steer institutions to achieve statewide goals and priorities. So that's a very good example of how colleges and universities have a different set of priorities than trying to increase access. Even when that's part of their mission, right? There are other incentives they have in place that motivate behavior. And so I think the question really for state policymakers is the extent to which they want to try to advocate for an agenda that's different than just raising the rankings. This was part of the tension in Texas, right? So policymakers also do want to have research universities that are recognized in the nation's elite. And so we raised the question, can you really have both? When you only have so much amount of money, can you really focus on resources on leveling the playing field and raising opportunity for the least well-served and increasing resources in research universities that don't typically serve the low-income students? There's so Georgia also is interesting. So the Georgia Hope Scholarship Program gets a lot of attention, but one thing I learned through our study is that Georgia also has the Hope Grant Program. And so this is a program that essentially provides free tuition and not based on, so at the time of our study, it wasn't based on any academic criteria. It paid for folks in non-degree programs, right? And so that's essentially programs at the technical college. And so that would seem to be a mechanism to create opportunity. And part of what we try to stress in the book is just the importance of unpacking some of this. So because it didn't have an academic component, it disproportionately enrolls students from low-income families and students of color. So it provides, right, we could point to that as a good thing, it's providing opportunity. The challenge is, though, it provides access to the non-degree programs, right? And so that's a different type of path than providing opportunity to get an associate's degree or a four-year degree. And if you can't make the academic criteria to get the Hope Grant, the Hope Scholarship, then you're on these two different tracks. It also, there were also structural mechanisms that limited at the time of our study the extent to which folks could transfer from the technical colleges into the 2-year and 4-year colleges in the state. There's been a lot of change in Georgia. And then with the lottery shortfall, they added an academic merit component to the Hope grant. So there's, Georgia needs some help.
Yes. And please identify yourself to everybody.
Sure. I'm Heidi Julian from the Department of Library and Information Studies. I'm an alien resident in this country, not a label that I particularly enjoy, but nevertheless, it gives me a certain perspective. So my question is, are there any lessons to be learned from outside of the U.S. To address some of the goals that you've talked about today?
That's a great question. So when I look at my lines of research, it reminds me how old I'm getting, but one of my more recent waves of research has been the opportunity to go to other places and think about higher education opportunity. And I've learned so much by being able to step out of our US-centric context and think about how things work in other places, and it raises questions for how things go here. One of the most important insights, I think, for me, well, one of the many, has been going to places like Ireland, where it's a very, there's no choice. Your outcome is dependent on your score on a test, right? And so it's a very structured and a system where, so you take your high school leaving exam, there's one test rather than the seemingly infinite number of tests that we have here. And your score on that test, with that, you get matched to a college. So, you know, the colleges specify how many folks they want with different test score thresholds in different major fields. And so there's that matching process that happens right there based on your test score. The other thing, at the time we went, so countries around the world are also facing similar questions. When we were in Ireland, the policy was that the government was funding students for 4 years. They were paying 4 years of tuition for folks. And so the incentive was, guess what, finish in 4 years, because you have 4 years of funding. And so that's an incentive. Don't change your major field, don't change your institution, stay on track and finish in 4 years. So that would never work in the US because we say that we value choice. And for me, it just underscores how important it is for us to really make sure that choice is a real thing. You know, here it works against people who aren't able to figure out how to get done in 4 years and figure out how to make good choices.
Hi, my name is Josh Altamos. I'm a first-year grad student in the Higher Ed Admin Student Affairs program. My question is with your research and other research, how does undocumented students factor in? Because by the nature of undocumented students and depending on the state, they can't even apply to school or have access to financial aid at all.
Right. It's a really important issue for sure. And it's one that needs more attention. You know, so there are some challenges in trying to fully understand the problem and the extent to which students are experiencing different challenges along the way with regard to, from a data perspective. Some institutions, so there's some variation across states and across institutions in the extent to which there are, the extent to which there's the ability to pay in-state tuition and qualify for different types of financial aid. I think it's one of those issues we have to take on more explicitly from both an institutional practice and a public policy perspective. Have you looked at this at all, Lois?
No. I've heard other people talk about exactly this point. I mean, certainly that's something America's going to have to face.
Yeah.
Hello.
Hi.
Michael Radasta. I'm with a second-year doctoral student in learning and instruction. And my question is if you have seen anything move at maybe the institutional level to begin to think more about instruction and pedagogy of these new students coming in and situating them to college, you know, in college, and rethinking how instruction is and coursework is delivered, which is traditionally built on an affluent white male model that is centuries old, rethinking the model now with all these new people coming to college.
Yeah, really, really good question. I've been thinking about this from two different perspectives recently. So on my campus, I'm involved in a project now. So Penn has a policy now, an ostensible loan replacement program, a no loan policy. And so, I've looked a little bit about these policies. Apparently, even with a no loan policy, people still have loans on campus. And so that raises a question, right? So why do people still use, and they could be a whole host of reasons, right? But there's some indication that it's even, low income students can't figure out how to pay the range of costs that they have with the financial aid that they're awarded. And so, and there's been some attention in the student newspaper about this issue. And along with this now, just this past week, there was a very compelling article by a student who participated in Quest Bridge. And so for those of you who don't know, this is one of those programs like Posse Foundation. There's some organizations out there now that are trying to help mostly selective institutions increase the numbers of low-income students on campus. And they help to provide some mechanisms to students and to institutions to increase that. So the student was talking about how effective Quest Bridge was in getting them to Penn, but then they get to Penn and there's not that same level of support. That was the argument essentially. And so people on campus they're raising this question, how do we do better? So Penn has made progress in increasing the share of students of Pell Grant who are receiving Pell Grants on campus, but still it's a minority, about 15%, and within a relatively affluent context. Figuring out how to serve that population is something that I think I think campuses are raising the question, trying to figure it out. The second aspect that I think is important with your question, it has to do with pedagogy per se. And in the higher ed research, it's very limited. It's amazing, really, how little. There's some notable scholars who pay attention to these issues, like Anna Newman and some others. But for me, this issue struck home when I was trying to do the research on MOOCs, right? And so here I'm asking these questions about what's happening in MOOCs that we don't ask about, I don't typically ask anyhow, about what happens in other types of instructional experiences. What are students learning? What are the mechanisms by which students are engaged? How do we measure that? How do we define it? I think it's a really important type of issue. There are some who talk about, and I think this is really important, I think the key to raising completion rates has to get at the nature of what happens in the classroom. And so Vince Tinto, some of his most recent work is talking about this issue. I think it's a good area for us as a student for you to be looking at to help us understand it better. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Bonnie Fox-Garrity. I'm a business professor, and I tend to write about for-profit higher education. I'm not particularly fond of it. And I was wondering if you found states that were particularly supportive or critical of the proliferation of for-profit higher ed.
Yeah, really good question. So in Maryland, very small share of students are enrolled in for-profit institutions, and so intentionally limiting at the time of our study. One of the issues that we raise at the end of the book is, especially with regard to thinking about how states might think about using its capacity to try to meet needs, is really just even having a more intentional approach about for-profits. And so we were collecting data in 2008, 9, 10. At that time, the only conversation really that folks at the state level were raising about for-profits was around regulation. And so certainly that's an important issue, right? And we heard a lot about just the burden of trying to maintain regulation. But I think there could be room for a more thoughtful approach to try to think, because there's not all good or all bad in any of our sectors, trying to think about how we might use that capacity in a more thoughtful perspective. So, yeah, those are the two observations, yeah.
Hi, Laura.
Hi.
I'm Margaret Salee. I'm an assistant professor in higher ed, and I wanted to bring us back to the conversation about access when you were talking about the Georgia Hope Scholarship. And recently, as you probably know, Tennessee just came out with free community college for everybody. And I was just curious your thoughts about what that is going to do for access, broadly speaking.
Yes, good question. So some are pointing to Tennessee's model as being a little bit different than what perhaps President Obama had outlined. I think so there are a couple of things that I really like about what Obama had said. So I think that drawing attention to how important affordability is in terms of trying to increase access is really important, because it does matter, right? And so figuring out what affordable options are for everybody is really important. I also like the component of that initial proposal that tried to specify what the obligation and responsibility was of different players. So identifying a federal contribution, a state and local contribution, and then an institutional and a student responsibility. I think that's what we need to be moving towards, really intentionally and explicitly specifying what the roles, responsibilities, obligations are of these different players. I worry a little bit about free community college tuition, though. So community college is free for low-income students in many places, right? Because the students get Pell, the tuition is low on average, and the low-income students get Pell grants. That's essentially free. And so if we use our finite public resources to make it free for everyone, it just raises a question about whether that's the right allocation of those resources. Why not make all types of colleges? So, because the second worry I have is just the extent it might increase the segregation or further skew the representation of different groups at different sectors, right? Especially, right, so that promise of free tuition, and we should talk about that part too, is it really free? But of community colleges might make more low-income students and more students of color attracted to community colleges. But if we don't have good pathways, which we don't now, we don't have good pathways from community colleges into four-year colleges, I worry about what that might mean for educational attainment across groups. I also, and then I would be curious about your perspective on this as well. I have a little bit of a problem with the continued emphasis on free, because tuition and fees are just one part of the cost of paying for higher education. There are other costs that, and this goes back to the no loan thing, right? So figuring out how much it really does cost for students from different groups to be enrolled in higher education, we have to have a more explicit conversation about that, because there are differences in understandings of what that means for students from low income versus higher income families. So your thoughts on it?
Well, I think I agree in terms of the problems about supporting free college tuition, because ultimately it's going to replicate what's going on in Georgia in a lot of ways in terms of stratification. I think what they've also seen in Tennessee is the consequences it's having on some of the lower tier, for lack of a better word, four-year institutions.
Right.
So their enrollment is declining, which means that the whole system, if we're talking about looking at systems and public policy, they're not really paying attention to context.
Yep, that's a really important point. There are many institutions, less selective institutions right now, that are struggling financially. I think we might see some changes in both with the private and the publics moving forward, just in terms of the financial viability going forward. Yeah, that's good. That's an important consequence. Thanks.
Folks, we have about 6 minutes, so please come up, and we'd love to hear your questions.
Hi, my name is Young. I'm a doctoral student in education psychology. I heard some people talked about the balance wheel theory. So kind of higher education serve as a balance wheel because some other K-12 education or medical or correction, those parts that the federal government and the state, they put a lot of money on that. And then it's a really interesting story that you make about the 5 states. And then have you thought about some of this application, and then whether there are any difference in 5 states about the balance wheel theory?
Right, so that's an interesting question. Thank you. So the notion of the balance wheel essentially is that from a state government perspective, when revenues decline, the rationale is that it's okay to reduce appropriations to higher education institutions because higher education institutions have this other form of revenue. They can raise tuition. And so that makes them different than K through 12 schools or hospitals or whatnot. And so, the balance wheel is this notion of, in economic downturns, appropriations go down, tuition goes up, and then in economic good times, states correct and they appropriate more money to higher ed, and over time, it's a kind of a cyclical type of pattern. One of the issues, so there are folks who have written about this in relatively recent times. So I have a volume that's edited with Michael McClendon that came out in September through the Annals of the American Academy of Political and Social Science. And there are 2 papers in there that have to do with the financing of higher education. One is by Jennifer Delaney, and she talks about the literature on the balance wheel and the pattern of state appropriations and state financial aid over time. And so that may be a good resource. The other is by Will Doyle and Bill Zametta. And what they do in their paper is they look at, and I think they built off of our study, because Bill Zametta was helpful in informing our work in earlier stages, and trying to what they tried to do in their paper is try to categorize state responses to the economic downturn and trying to understand or just put states in different groups. So one of the strategies they identified was the hunker down and wait strategy. And so basically just trying to go 1 year at a time and just hope that the recession will end and state revenues will rebound and the money will be there and the problem will solve itself. And to some extent that's what we found in our states, right? I'm trying to think of the other strategies. One was a strategy around shifting, like a trade-off strategy. And we did see this too. So where in return for reduced appropriations to institutions, states would give more authority to institutions to do certain things like set tuition, right? And so we saw this in Washington State, for example, it was a trade-off really. Where the public four-year institutions came back to the state hard and said, if you're going to cut our appropriations, we want to raise tuition higher. And so tuition went up pretty dramatically there. And so we saw that, and so that would be the balance wheel effect too that we saw there. But I'd be happy to share the reference to this piece that might be helpful to you. Yeah.
Hello, Dr. Perna. My name is Jenny Cerniak. I'm a first-year doctoral student in the ECPS program. My question is, how would you consider transformative leadership at the institutional level as a viable approach to alleviating the equity issues that you found in your research?
That's a good question. Do you have a particular example in mind?
Maybe like social justice issues in relation to racial inequalities?
I think it's a great question. So over the course of my career, I've shied away from focusing on leadership because I've just thought leadership is too variable. It's not something I can, package nicely and say, this is, if you do these things, we'll have good leadership. I think leadership really does matter. It matters a whole lot in terms of trying to get things done. It certainly matters at the state policy level, and I think it matters at the institutional level. We have to have clear identification of the goals that we're trying to achieve, and then we have to have practices, policies aligned towards achieving those goals, and we have to have leadership that can build consensus among the relevant players for these goals. So I've looked at this less at the institutional level, but of our states, so one example in our states is Illinois. So Illinois, at the time of our study, had the most beautiful looking master plan that you could imagine, right? Multicolored, beautifully formatted, had attention to all the different types of data that would document each stage of the problem, and you know, so I had a couple problems, an endless list of recommendations. But the other thing was that it wasn't shared by anyone, by others in the state. So we heard comments from a variety of different stakeholders where they just didn't see that it was a plan that was going to move forward. And so I think that leadership, it's not enough to have a plan. You have to get buy-in from folks to really advance that, especially when there are these other, you know, people are going to have different priorities. Not everyone agrees that increasing attainment and closing gaps in attainment are the right things to do. So I think leadership, transformative leadership really does matter. Yeah.
Okay, one more question.
First of all, thank you very much for this comprehensive and thoughtful lecture.
Thank you.
My name is Janina Brod-Gröfler. I'm the chair of the Department of Leadership and Policy. I wanted perhaps maybe you can elaborate further in terms of the place of English language learners in your study. Is there assumption that the minority groups whom you have in the study face similar questions or issues in terms of access or equity? And what are the implications for policy in terms of the level of the state as well as federal?
It's an excellent question. And so your question is in that other, so I pointed out at least one other thing I would do over if I were going to do this again. So one would be to make the equity part of my model, our model, more explicit. The second would be to have more attention to this issue of English language learners. We don't talk about that in our book, but I think it is one of the really important emerging issues that we have to be paying more attention to from the perspective of public policy and institutional practice.
We will be closing this. There is a small reception, I believe, outside. Please, I know that the goal of this series, this Dean's Lecture Series, is not only to hear these wonderful lectures, but for us to continue talking to one another. And as a researcher and knowing Laura Perna's work over many years, I just want to stress how iterative a process this really is. I mean, she answers one question and she immediately goes to the next question. So this is a long time in coming, and each step leads her to another set of questions. And the questions now are so large and increasingly interdisciplinary and multi-method, I think you would agree with me, that as we move forward, we're going to have to build large teams with lots of stakeholders. So everybody sitting here is potentially a part of these questions and a part of these answers. We need people in the field. We need people who are researchers at universities. We need cohorts of graduate students and undergraduate helpers. And I think we should all imagine that this is the way, what Laura Perna has outlined, is the way research is going to go forward, and that it's going to take a lot of different stakeholders to make these things happen. I don't know if you want to make one last comment on that, or if that's a reasonable...
I think that's right. You know, I think, I don't know whether it's age or just reflection on the field, but it's so important for us to be working together. These problems are so big. You know, we're not going to solve them just talking to ourselves or working in isolation. We have to figure out how to make connections across different types of stakeholders and really meaningful connections. And one of the things I'm trying to do with ASH is try to build conversations between the researchers and the policymakers and practitioners. I've begun some foundational conversations, and people we care about the same issues, but we're approaching them differently. And unless we build more of a common understanding, I think we're not going to get to where we need to be.
Okay. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
This is